everybody. Today we are debating whether or not salt proves God, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for another epic debate. As today we have good old Misha Popoff and Raging Atheist joining us. It's going to be a lot of fun. These are experienced debaters, they've been in a lot. You could say friends of the show. And today is going to be a wild one, folks. They're going to be debating, you heard it, whether or not salt proves God. So it's going to be epic. It's going to be just amazing. And I want to let you know, if this is the first time you've ever been here, consider hitting that subscribe button is we've got a lot more debates coming up. In fact, I've got to say, you guys, I'm stoked for a couple. First, if you haven't heard yet, if you somehow have not heard about this one, it's going to be off the charts, folks. This is Matt Dillahunty and Inspiring Philosophy Michael Jones, who will be coming on Saturday. So it's just about a week from now to debate whether or not there are good reasons to believe in God. So that's going to be epic, folks. And just today, you may not believe this. You may be like, "Oh, James, come on, are you serious? Are you bullcrapping me?" No, I'm totally serious. Let me show you this, you guys. We are stoked that just today we booked Sargon and Vosh. So that will be coming up a week after the Michael Jones and Matt Dillahunty debate. So that one is also going to be epic. A lot of epicness going on here, folks.
Terrific.
Now, what we are going to do is switch over. So, getting into this debate, folks, this is going to be a lot of fun. We have, as I mentioned, Misha Popoff and Raging Atheist who are debating whether or not salt proves God. And so I want to let you know their links are in the description. If you're listening and you're like, I like that. I want more. Well, you can get more by clicking just down below in that little description box down there. Also, I want to let you know if you have a question during this debate, feel free to fire it into the live chat. I will pull your questions out, and then I will ask those during the Q&A. So, with that, folks, glad to have you here, whether you're Christian, atheist, Republican, Democrat, no matter what you are, where you're from, stoked to have you here for this debate, and we will start with Misha. Misha, I've got a roughly 10-minute opening statement. Doesn't have to use all of it, and that's flexible, so the floor is all yours, Misha.
Great. Good to be here. Hi, Rage, and hi, James. So I think most people have heard the expression to be salt and light. You've seen it on bumper stickers and T-shirts. So even if you're not Christian, you're familiar with the expression. And this comes from, of course, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he said all these crazy things like, blessed are those who mourn, right? And blessed are you if you are, if you're being chastised or something. All these, as they describe it, he basically turned the world upside down. But the key thing that I got out of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Is the passage where he says, if salt loses its flavor, wherewith shall it be salted? And interestingly, most people refer to Matthew when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount, so including that phrase, if salt loses its flavor, wherewith shall it be salted? But only in Luke, so Mark also covers that, Matthew and Mark, but only Luke says the key phrase, and I'm just going to pull up my Bible here to make sure I get it right. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the land nor yet for the dunghill, but men cast it out. So what that means, in my humble opinion, is Jesus is not talking about common salt or table salt. First of all three of those gospel writers, Matthew and Mark, John doesn't even mention this, by the way, but they all say that key phrase, if salt loses its flavor. So a lot of people just assume that, well, Jesus is being some sort of loose metaphor, saying, well, we know salt can't lose its flavor, but if it did, how would it be reflavored? Well, there's a different kind of salt that he's referring to here. That's saltpeter, which is, of course, nitrogen. We now call that nitrogen. It's not actually a salt, but in Jesus' day, they basically thought anything that wasn't sweet to the taste, that was a white, powdery, crystallized substance, they thought that was a species or a variety of salt. And so, using the language of his day, Jesus says, if salt loses its flavor, and of course, he's referring to us, if we lose our salt, what good are we? Well, not only do we have salt in us, we have saltpeter in us. We have nitrogen. That's what makes all the protein and muscle and sinew in our body. Our bones are made out of calcium, but all the musculature in your body, it has protein in it, which is made from nitrogen. And that, again, is the modern term we use for saltpeter. So yeah, salt can't lose its flavor, but saltpeter can. It evaporates, it dissipates. It can also wash away with water, but then so can common salt. But even when salt dissolves, it still has its flavor. But saltpeter is fleeting. So there it is in your muscles, and when you die, it'll return to the earth from whence it came, and eventually return to the earth's atmosphere. Unlike table salt, which only has a crystal or a liquid form, if you dissolve it, it's not really liquid; it's still crystal inside the water. But in any case, saltpeter has all three forms at ambient temperature on the surface of the earth. It's in a solid, liquid, or gaseous form. 70% of the Earth's atmosphere above our heads is actually nitrogen, or as the ancients called it, saltpeter. So I think that's what Jesus is referring to. He's not actually referring to salt hypothetically losing its savor, its flavor, which would be impossible. He's referring to saltpeter. And then the next line, and this is the line that only Luke quotes. The other two just sort of leave off with that. They say, if salt lost its flavor, what good would it be? Luke finishes the thought. He most accurately captures what Jesus was saying, adding in, once saltpeter loses its flavor, it is no longer good for the land nor for the dunghill. Now, a dunghill, that's where, of course, you get saltpeter, nitrogen. And one of the best ways to get more saltpeter out of your dunghill is to add saltpeter to it at the start, sort of kickstart it, kind of like you would if you were making sourdough bread or yogurt. Inoculate the pile with already finished saltpeter. So that really is the giveaway, I think, in Luke, that he says Peter, I'm saying, would no longer be good for the land. Well, salt is really never good for the land, and certainly not for a dunghill. Now, some people think you can use salt in a dunghill, but I'll leave that for now. Happy to answer to that if that should come up. But basically, in layman's terms, anyone can understand. Well, salt kills things. I mean, you don't go sprinkle salt on your tulips out front, right? You go buy a flower fertilizer, or if you're growing tomatoes in your backyard, you go buy, and usually the first ingredient, the most important ingredient in any fertilizer is nitrogen. So that's your NPK formula on fertilizers. And yeah, there's pretty much always nitrogen, for some rare exceptions. So without nitrogen, you don't have plant life, you don't have protein, you don't have meat, you don't have muscle. And I think that's really what Jesus is getting at, that if we lose our saltpeterness, if we lose our nitrogen, we're finished, literally, but also spiritually.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Misha. And with that, we'll flip it over to Raging Atheist for his opening statement. If you like one, otherwise, if you want, we can go right into open discussion. It's up to you, Rage.
Yeah. I'll take one real quick. So I'm an honest interlocutor. I was wondering why Misha wanted this debate, especially titled "Does Salt Prove God?" And we just found out before the stream that Misha was hoping to be debating a Christian and be on the negative of this debate. So I'm gonna grant him that, and I'm gonna be an honest interlocutor and just let the audience know we're not really debating does salt prove God, as you just heard, because Misha has conceded that he's not talking about salt; he's talking about saltpeter. Um, so I had a prepared statement. I'll read some of it because it changed up a little bit with just trying to be honest about it. I'm not going to take advantage because I was really wondering like why he wanted to have this debate. So my opponent has made some really very odd claims here, claims that not only go against the thinking of Christian scholars, but against history itself. And I'm not going to say that because I was going to remind you that it's about salt. Um, so, uh, So I'm interested in diving down this rabbit hole with you, Misha, but you're going to need to prove some things here. For one, you're going to have to prove, is Jesus in fact talking about saltpeter and not salt? And is salt even relevant to what Jesus is saying? Two, upon proving that point, since Jesus really meant to say saltpeter and not salt, that now turns the debate into the question, does saltpeter prove the existence of God? Three, with that new debate topic, can my opponent prove that saltpeter proves the existence of God? You're going to have to do that to win this debate. Four, can my opponent then prove that ancient Jews were using saltpeter as gunpowder, since its use for such wasn't discovered until 1300 BCE by the Mongols of China, which is a claim that he makes? And five, what historical or biblical evidence does he have that this gunpowder was kept in the Ark of the Covenant and used to level the walls of Jericho? Another of my opponent's claims.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
if
Good
the debate
stuff.
were indeed, does saltpeter prove the existence of God, my opponent would need to provide evidence for each of those points. Any other point that might be brought up that not only goes against known history, but Christian scholarship as well. But again, I'm not going to say that. I was going to remind you it's about salt. It's not about salt. So, with that, I'm just going to see the time. That's all I need.
Sure.
Because I was like, why does he want to have this debate with me about salt? Why not title it, "What does saltpeter prove the existence of God?" So we'll have that debate.
Right. Well,
Perfect.
good point, Rage. Because in Jesus' day, and actually right up until, as you say, until the 13th or 14th century, um, things were referred to as salt. They just classified. So, for instance, what we now recognize as baking soda, what we now recognize as borax, which is a detergent, and those were all just recognized as salt. So Jesus is using the language of the day. The Jews, the Hebrews, and whoever else had knowledge of this important secret, they knew that you said salt, you had to clarify. If someone was going to sell you a bag of salt, well, that's great. You could get all the common salt you needed. A little bit of labor was involved, but we're talking like 100 times or maybe even 1,000 times more labor to get a bag of saltpeter. Meanwhile, things like baking soda that were also called salt, those were just picked up along the side of the Nile. And they can still pick that up all day long. It's basically free. But yeah, so it was literally salt at the time. And the amazing part is that Jesus is revealing probably what a lot of people knew, that this particular species of saltpeter, was good for the land or the dunghill. But it's the next phrase that actually Luke leaves out. This is why you need all four gospel writers. But where Matthew coins the phrase that I mentioned in the intro that we see on T-shirts and bumper stickers, to be salt and light. If we're just talking about common salt, that doesn't make any sense. It's a mixed metaphor. There's not even a metaphor to be had, really. But if he's referring to saltpeter, then we get what he means by light. Saltpeter, of course, is the oxidizing agent in gunpowder, sort of as you alluded to there.
Well, I mean, the Romans was using saltpeter as early as 160 BCE to preserve food and for seasoning. They also used salt. China was using saltpeter to preserve food, and they knew the difference between salt and saltpeter. Jesus would have clearly known the difference between salt and saltpeter, because if the Romans were using saltpeter, well, the Romans were occupying Jerusalem. Saltpeter would have been a thing in that time. So, I don't think that he would have called saltpeter. Let's talk about the verses. So, yeah, you claim that Luke is the most important verse, right? The reference to this one in Luke. All right, so Luke, chapter
he's
14.
the only one who gets the land.
All right, so with Luke, it's Luke chapter 14, verses 34 through 35. It's the very end of chapter 14 that he says, Jesus is speaking. He says, salt is good, but if the salt has lost its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the land nor for the dunghill, but men throw it out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So that is coming at the very end of the chapter, and that chapter spoke of many things. It had Jesus heals the man with dropsy on the Sabbath. He gives the parable of the lowly place. He then gives the parable of the Great Supper, which starts the conversation about actual food, the teaching of leaving all to follow Christ. Many things happen before these last two sentences at the very end of the chapter. And Luke doesn't actually say much. Matthew actually says more about it, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, Matthew, first of all, quotes what we now recognize as the entire Sermon on the Mount, and then we just get bits and pieces,
Yeah.
including this from Luke.
So,
Yeah.
so in
But
Luke,
yeah.
in chapter 15, it goes on and it just stops with that. It doesn't say
Yeah.
you get those two
Right.
sentences and that's it, right?
Yeah. And by the way, so on that note, I don't propose that Luke knew, that any of them knew what Jesus was referring to. That they just recorded in good faith sort of what they remember hearing on that day, 3 of the 4 of them, and they're all a little bit different, but Luke is the one who captures the important inclusion of the land and the dunghill, again, which is where you would not
he gives 2 lines and that's it. But Matthew actually gives a lot more. So Matthew 5
way
13
more. Yeah.
This is actually a teaching about his believers, and you're right, he's talking on the Sermon of the Mount, and he's speaking directly to his believers, and he's telling them, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. And then it goes on, 14 through 16 says, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in his house. I think some versions say bushel. I use the King James version usually when I do my research. And it ends, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, this is obviously, this whole salt reference is obviously a metaphor about the believers in Christ at the time. I think a lot of Christians today would say that it's about all future believers in Christ, and basically saying that the believers of Christ are going to be a beacon, a shining beacon. And it's just a metaphor. So the salt isn't even important. And I know you're going to go into the whole light thing. I'll let you do that before I get too involved. But I mean, it's clearly a metaphor. The salt isn't even important. So it doesn't even matter if salt loses its flavor. It's not a story about salt. It's a story about people.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, we have salt in us. We have literal common salt or table salt, but we also have saltpeter or nitrogen in us. And so, yeah, then it comes to the light. So is Jesus, that's sort of a first year college mistake that you'd hand a paper in and you'd get back some red marks on it saying, don't mix your metaphors, the quick fox is really good at making dinner. No. The quick fox is good at running. You're supposed to stick with the metaphor, stick with the train of thought. So as you read through Luke, who goes into far greater depth, he mentions salt more than once and mentions light more than once, and then in fact concludes with light. So yeah, you could say, well, salt is just a thing in there. But again, salt doesn't lose its savor.
Well, what I'm saying though is he's not talking about salt losing its flavor he's talking about people losing their faith. It's a metaphor, and the whole thing, Jesus is speaking in parables, allegory, and metaphor. So the salt is irrelevant. He's talking to people, and he's telling them not to lose faith because they're going to save the world. That's essentially what he's telling them. You can only save this world if you have faith in me, and if you keep that faith. If you lose that faith, you're going to lose your flavor. You're going to be useless salt. But continue.
But there is no useless salt. Salt never loses its flavor.
He's referring to useless people. Again, salt. Yeah. The word salt is merely a description. It has no real relevance to what he's trying to teach. He's speaking about people.
Well, yeah, but he's saying the people are the salt of the earth. So he's using a metaphor with salt. And then if we come to Luke, I mean, it's unmistakable. Then it's no longer a metaphor. He says the salt, when it loses its flavor, is no longer good for the land or the dunghill. I mean, that's not a metaphor anymore. Maybe you can say Matthew's being metaphorical, but they're
Well,
recording the same speech by
as I
Jesus.
said
So
with Luke, it comes at the end of a chapter where he is speaking in parables and metaphors and allegory through that whole chapter. And in Luke specifically, he had the teaching of the Great Supper. So they were literally speaking about food.
yeah, you don't have food if you don't have saltpeter. That's
Mm,
that's where that's where saltpeter, not salt,
well,
although they
salt.
called it salt at the time. That's where saltpeter proves Jesus. Like I've said before, he's either a man who has great wisdom, or he's God and he knows everything. He's omniscient because he knows that this salt, this particular species of salt, is very important, as you're saying, for food. It's without it, you don't have food.
Well,
You do have food without almond salt. It just won't taste as good.
One thing, just to be sure, there are a
yeah,
couple
gotcha.
people in the live chat still trying to get kind of, you could say, like the concise, crisp
Good luck.
argument that you're giving here, Misha. And I just think that they want to for sure understand in the most concise, like
Yeah.
way of stating it.
Sure. We're so even if you're not Christian, we all hear the metaphor. Um, oh, James, he's a great guy. He's worth his salt. These metaphors, or if I said James, he comes from good farming people. His great granddaddy was the salt of the earth. These are all from these biblical passages that Rage and I are quoting, all from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that was recorded by Matthew, Luke, and
Yeah,
Mark,
people
not
come up with
John.
terms. Yeah.
Yeah. So whenever we've heard that, even outside of the context of the Bible, everyone assumes it means salt because we do it. When you sweat, salt comes out of your pores, and when you release your fluids, you should have some salt in it to replace that salt that your body is losing. But yeah, I'm saying no, that's not what Jesus is referring to here, because first of all, salt can't lose its savor. And second of all, because only in Luke, as Rage points out, it's at the end of the chapter. The other two guys don't mention this. But apparently Jesus said, if salt loses its flavor, it's no longer good for the land. And that begs that saltpeter. So now go back through your life whenever you've said, hey, James, you're the salt of the earth. You're worth your salt.
No,
It,
he's literally referring, even in Luke, like he's literally referring to
well,
his
wait, but
believers and his
Rage,
futures believers. Like
Let's
he's
Rage,
literally
just wait.
referring to their
let's
faith.
just if you
Rage,
can,
I'm
if
just trying to finish up the explanation for James, and then tear it apart, please. But whenever someone says that, like oh, you're the salt of the earth, or you're worth your salt, the metaphor not only still works with saltpeter instead of salt, it actually works better. I'm saying, and Jesus knew that. Sorry, Rage, go ahead.
wait,
Well, no,
so
I'm
when
just
you
saying
say
that the metaphor
saltpeter,
stands.
do you mean like potassium nitrate or like
All
another
right,
chemical compound?
so James, saltpeter, it hasn't been used in quite a while. We cracked the code of it about 1890 or so. We no longer really use it, and they didn't really use it to preserve. It has a lot of. We'll get into saltpeter later, but saltpeter is different than salt, and it has a different. It has something called niter. Misha will be able to tell you more about
Yeah,
this. It has something called
nitrogen.
niter that turns into nitrate.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying that the passage seems to fit better with this other type of salt rather than like sodium
Yes.
chloride, it would be like
Right.
potassium nitrate.
Yeah, he's
Right.
maintaining that
Exactly.
Jesus didn't mean salt, but saltpeter.
Yes.
That's what
Exactly.
he's maintaining.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think I get what you mean. So that's like, and from there, just to be sure I understand, like there must be other parts that I'm missing.
Yeah, well, the salt and light, that's another metaphor you've heard, not so much outside of Christian circles, but to be salt and light. And that comes up in Matthew right after this passage. Matthew quotes Jesus saying, to be salt and light. Well, just what does that mean? If we're talking about common salt, what is salt and light? There's no connection between the two, but there's definitely a connection between saltpeter and light. So now, leaving fertilizer, it's the key ingredient in gunpowder. And yes, Rage is right. It was until about all the wars up till World War One, the nitrogen they used in gunpowder was potassium nitrate, also known as saltpeter. And then it was Fritz Haber, the brilliant German Jew, who figured out how to pull ammonium nitrate out of the Earth's atmosphere. So you're right. So since the end of World War I, they switched from saltpeter based, and some musket guys still use black powder, that's saltpeter, instead of ammonia nitrate. But yes, it's as you said, James, saltpeter is potassium nitrate. It's not a salt. It's just they erroneously called it a salt.
Okay.
And one other thing, by the way, Rage mentioned the Romans knew about saltpeter, yes, but they didn't call it saltpeter. They called it niter.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they called it. I'm sure.
Yeah. The term was never used. That's why Jesus, he has no choice but to say salt, because that's all anyone knew. And then, like I said, if you were in the market for some salt or saltpeter, it would be very important to distinguish. It'd be like if you're in the market for some fuel. Well, do you want diesel or gasoline? It'd be very important to distinguish.
You need to establish that he was indeed talking about saltpeter, and you're getting to your point here that I think that is probably vital to your argument, and that's the light aspect of it, because that's what really gives it the difference between salt, because salt's used to preserve food. The light aspect is what makes the saltpeter unique in reference to salt itself, I would think.
Yeah, and ironically, I have to admit, Luke misses that. So someone might say, well, wait a minute, I thought you were staking your whole argument on the passage in Luke 14. But no, everyone already knows this. The gospel writers are human. They're fallible. So even though they're inspired by God, we need all four of them. And the apostles too, the book of Acts and everything thereafter. We need all of that to sort of piece together a framework of what Jesus is getting at in his philosophy of life.
Gotcha. And so, just to kind of connect the dots, is it that if saltpeter is more valuable, are you saying that it would mean that Jesus was saying that like Christians were more valuable?
No, although that's certainly an important aspect of it. Again, we're talking 100-fold.
He's
or
not even
1,000-fold.
that Jesus is predicting the future. Go ahead, I'll let you say it. I'm not going to steel man you.
Okay, forgive me. So you're saying like you wouldn't even say it's a metaphor. So you're not saying it like makes the metaphor more extreme or increases its magnitude. You would say it's just Jesus is just talking about salt in that passage. He's not referring to Christian people.
Oh, no. Rage is right about that. He's referring to people, and Rage kind of dismisses the metaphor, whereas I think if you understand that he doesn't mean salt, common salt, then you can't dismiss the metaphor. I don't think you'd dismiss it anyway.
Well,
but
if he's talking to people, it really doesn't matter. The adjective doesn't really matter. The description doesn't really matter. What matters is the teaching, the underlying. But go ahead, because we're getting to the good part now, and I really want you to get there because I'm holding myself back.
Yeah. So if Jesus could have used any metaphor, then I guess he could have said, like he later says to Peter, "You're the rock. Upon this rock I will build my church." And by the way, he's not literally referring to Peter. He's referring to Peter's faith. In any case, there's other times when he uses other metaphors. So why is he using salt here? And as Rage was gracious enough to read through Matthew, which is the go-to gospel writer for the Sermon on the Mount, he doesn't just say salt once like Luke does. He says it repeatedly, and then it's always in association with light. So there is there's no connection between common salt and light. None.
Okay.
But there is between saltpeter and light.
Can I ask a question just really quick, just to be sure, just because the audience. So I think I get it. Are you saying that it was that Jesus like prophesied that saltpeter was extremely valuable, that he knew it even before other people of that time knew it?
No.
No. You could say that. By the way, Rage is saying, if you stick with the mainstream notion of history that saltpeter and gunpowder weren't developed until the 13th or 14th century, well then you have to imagine that Jesus is being prescient here. But no, I go with Rage's theory that the ancients knew all about that the ancients knew all about saltpeter and some form of gunpowder. Yeah, but you said they knew about saltpeter. I go a step further. I think once you know about saltpeter,
Well,
you know about gunpowder.
history says that the Romans knew about saltpeter as early as 160 BCE. I don't say that, history does.
Yeah, that's I think that's Pliny that you're looking at, Pliny, and he's referring to glass making. So definitely not a military or explosive use of
No, they were
saltpeter.
using it to preserve food, but they
Yeah,
mainly used salt because salt was easier to get.
yeah. Well, and not just easier, but like 100 or 1,000 times easier. I mean, uh, but saltpeter, it comes from feces, so you're looking at a ratio of like 1 to 100 for your if you want to get it in a crystalline form. Yeah, it's about you're looking at a
Yeah.
ratio of over
The, the,
100 to 1.
the Chinese started using it right after the Romans did. But the Chinese still has to this day the largest natural depository of saltpeter. So they actually perfected the practice of curing it, and they were the first to actually turn it into gunpowder
Yeah,
in 1300 BCE. Now, you
yeah,
maintain that the ancients were using it a lot longer before that, and
yeah.
that is what Jesus is referring to with his whole light metaphor. Am I not correct?
Yeah, so Jesus isn't predicting the future, as James was asking. He's revealing a military secret, and I would suggest that that could be one of many reasons they decided to get rid of him. And the gospel writers didn't know; they just sort of verbatim copied down what they remembered him saying. But yeah, I firmly believe once you get saltpeter, maybe you wait a decade or two, or maybe even a whole century. Once you have saltpeter, you have gunpowder in one form or another. It's only a matter of time through trial and error. And given human nature, we're always looking for ways of blowing each other up or killing each other. And there are, I'm sure you would agree, there are things from ancient times like Greek fire. If you watch the movie 300, I'm not going to use that as an academic citation for my work. But the movie 300, you see the guys with their shields there, and the wizards or the magicians from Persia are throwing those clay hand grenades at them that are exploding. Well, that would be saltpeter. And of course, again, it's just a stupid Hollywood movie, but they based that on good academic work. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear, well, it was a military secret. So it's only in the 13th or 14th century that the military secret comes out and then makes its way through the Middle East to Europe. It's less than a century, they say, between when China had gunpowder, what we now, and then Europe had it. But I'm saying, yeah, it goes back to ancient times. And once you have saltpeter, you have gunpowder. It's just a matter of time.
Okay,
Okay.
can I just forgive me, Rage,
Oh,
just to
go
be
ahead,
sure.
James.
I'm so sorry. It's just a tough one. It's one that I'm like still trying to be sure that I've got my
I
mind
got
wrapped around.
familiar with it this morning.
Is it so? You're saying, is it fair to say that kind of because so far we're like, okay, we get saltpeter is what you're saying he meant, but
Yeah.
we weren't sure like what's the kind of like supernatural lever, what's the kind of connecting point that gets us to theism. And I think you're
Mm.
saying that it seems to be kind of like clairvoyance, namely that if Jesus knew something that he would not have known by natural means, like, is that what you're saying, that Jesus maybe knew
Mm-mm.
something
He's
Yeah.
supernaturally?
maintaining, James, that there's nothing supernatural about this, that this was an ancient secret, that the Jews actually carried around this gunpowder made from saltpeter in the Ark of the Covenant and used it to level the walls of Jericho, and that Jesus is just simply revealing a truth that only the powerful knew at the time. That's what
Yeah.
he.
Yeah, Rage has done his homework. See,
Okay.
James, for all we know, it could be clairvoyance, if you will, and that would certainly be a good case to say Jesus was divine. But no, I actually think this is a run of the mill, down to earth military secret, and Jesus is revealing it. Yes.
Gotcha.
Okay, so
Yeah.
these are the issues that we're going to run into because, okay, yes, saltpeter was used in alchemy and by the occult for over 1,000 years, and they did make some what they were able to use its properties to make little, maybe put something in a glass. You have a chemical reaction; it would burn the person that it broke next to or whatever. But you're maintaining that they were actually using gunpowder, turning this gunpowder into explosives big enough to level the walls of Jericho, way back in the ancient days. So we're talking
Yeah.
way before Jesus. All
Yeah.
right. So, but the problem with that is that it just didn't happen. History does not show that one bit. You saying, oh, well, of course, if they had saltpeter, then they had gunpowder. No, no, you have to understand the chemistry of it. I'm not a chemist, but there is chemistry involved. You have to make that gunpowder using that formula and using that saltpeter for a very specific use in that gunpowder. So what you're saying just is not historically accurate at all. You're assuming something that history denies. We know that the Mongols were the first to make gunpowder and the Italians were second not long after. But the Mongols were
Yeah.
first in China because they had that natural deposit of saltpeter. So you now have to prove, and you know, we haven't even got past the point that Jesus was actually talking about saltpeter. I'm not done with that point, but now you have to prove that history is wrong and you are right. And
Hmm.
history has evidence behind it.
Yeah, so what we have tracing from China, whether it's the 13th or 14th century, through the Middle East, some people claim that the Arabs were the first or the Chinese were the first. It really doesn't matter. That's the direction it came, and it came to Europe. What we're talking about there is a weapon, like a gun of some sort. And you don't even need steel or iron. You can use single use. Some people say the Chinese would use a bamboo hollow bamboo tube to shoot something down, and then they would throw it on the ground, and they'd have a whole bunch of these, kind of like having arrows in your quiver. And they would have these all preloaded with a fuse, and they would just light it and use it in battle. And yes, that technology, let's call that an early gun or cannon. But what I'm talking about, and here we are, Rage, this is going to be ironic because you're going to have to defend God, but the walls of Jericho. Now I'm just joking, but my position is God didn't bring down the walls of Jericho. Joshua and his men did by sending spies into Rahab's house, which was on or in the wall. It was a double-walled city. And her house, they went under and undermined the wall and planted some form of gunpowder. So as you can see, this is not a weapon. So yes, there's probably some truth to the mainstream that being used in the form of a weapon that could shoot, that probably didn't come until the 13th or 14th century. But being used as an explosive underground, I don't think for a second that I'm a Christian. I don't think God brought down the walls of Jericho. I don't think marching around the city and sounding the trumpet did anything except signal the spies who were still in Rahab's apartment to go ahead and light the fuse on the seventh day. And what saltpeter gives you is oxygen underground. If you undermined a wall and then just lit a fire, well, it's just going to go out on its own, right? So what you do is you undermine, you dig a tunnel, and then you plant your explosive. And saltpeter provides the oxygen. That's why dynamite will explode in water. And that's a way people fishing, right? You light a stick of dynamite, throw it in the water, and yeah, it'll still explode underwater. So yeah, nothing can extinguish saltpeter once it's lit, and that's why it's a great way to undermine a wall, as we would see at Jericho. So I'm just joking. If you want to defend God and say no, he brought down the wall, but I don't know. Maybe you have some other explanation. That to me is the most
I don't believe God
logical
brought down a
explanation.
wall, and I don't. I mean, I don't think that history shows that we had explosives that long ago. Now, I'm not going to say, you know, who knows what the ancients were doing. I have to maintain I wasn't there, so I don't know. But I mean, we do have plenty of indication that not only the tribes of Israel, but many civilizations use just blunt warfare to lay siege to cities and overtake cities all the time. That plenty of cities thought that their walls were impenetrable until they weren't. And you didn't need God and you didn't need explosives to do it. We have plenty of instances of that. So, I mean, it's a perfectly rational explanation is that the Israelites just simply went out a siege. And then they glorified it and made, you know, God brought down the walls, or, you know, it could have been a number of things. I just don't think that history shows it. So I'm not saying that it's not possible, but if you're going to make a claim, you have to prove that claim. But let's talk about the light. So I
Well,
let you
wait,
go on for a while.
but back up
I'll
for
let you
just one
respond to
sec.
that, and then we'll get into light. Yeah.
Just one sec. I mean, the Israelites, if we trust their recording of the history, they didn't have siege engines. I mean, yes, you're right. You can lay there's cases prior to this, way earlier than when the Israelites brought down the walls of Jericho. There are many instances of sieges on walled cities, but Israelites have no. Again, if we trust their history, they have no siege engines. They spent 40 years in the desert, and what I think they were doing is gathering up feces and refining it and making saltpeter. And that's how long it took them to get enough explosives together they could feel confident that they could take out the Canaanites.
I mean, that's interesting. So, I mean, do you have any biblical citation? And I'll even take, and I'm a raging atheist. I usually don't take biblical citation, but
Rage. You'll like this one because this. Well, see, I'm debunking a lot of the divinity in the Old Testament. So the other one is what's his name? The guy. Gideon. So Gideon is his people are just long after this, long after the walls of Jericho were brought down. It's like generations later. Gideon chooses, I think it's 300 men out of all the thousands of Israelite soldiers. And he tells them, we're not going to use swords. They take lamps and they attack the enemies. I think it's the Amalekites or the Amalekites, whatever. They attack them with lamps. And Gideon tells them, don't light your lamp until I give the signal. So, it's like the old thing in the West, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, right? You want to get nice and close to the enemy. Why? Because these lamps they're going to light, I believe, are fueled by saltpeter. So that'll be like a firework shooting out of your lamp. And the Amalekites just run scared. So there's this story of a miracle. I don't think it's a miracle. I think Gideon took 300 men instead of 3,000 or 30,000 because they don't have a lot of this divine substance, this saltpeter, with which to do this basically psychological warfare. So that's another example, Rage, where again I'm going to strip away the divinity from the story. I think there's a perfectly logical explanation for how Gideon defeated the Amalekites.
All right, so I'm not too familiar with that story, but what I was going to ask is, do you have any biblical citation that this gunpowder or saltpeter, whatever mixture it was, any biblical citation that was kept in the Ark of the Covenant? Because as far as I understand, I've actually read some Jewish lore, I would call it, I guess, that would suggest that Yahweh actually lived in the Ark of the Covenant. I think most Christians believe that like some sacred things were kept in there. Like they don't believe that God lived in there, but sacred things. Do you have biblical citation that they kept gunpowder in that? Because that's one of the things that I heard you maintain specifically.
Yes.
Was that they brought the Ark of the Covenant around the walls of Jericho, circled it 7 times, and then
and again, you've done your homework. And no, I put it this way, I can't prove what was in the Ark, although it seems to me that this idea that God lived in it, no, again, I'm going to strip away the divinity, but I think that would really sequester God. And I like some Christians
kind of make him a tiny dude.
Yeah, and we got him like a rabbit in a cage. He's ours. And it just to me seems so childish. And a lot of Christians are, God bless them. They're very childish about these things. So the other theory, Rage, is that the Ark contained something that was nuclear or radioactive, because there's the story where they're going through some rough land. Yeah, and the Ark starts to tip, and this guy goes to push it up, and he falls dead. Well, I don't know. Maybe they stabbed him, because you're not supposed to. Pretty clear, you're not supposed to touch the Ark.
I could be naive on this, but I always thought like that came from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like, because of that movie, people think that now.
But I think we can agree it wasn't. I mean, why would it be nuclear? Why would it be radioactive? What would the And then there's no other story of the Israelites employing that radioactive substance or whatever it was. So I totally discount that. I agree with you, or I think we agree that they didn't literally have God in there. I mean, let's go ahead to the temple.
Unless it was like some really small alien.
Yeah. Well, but let's go ahead to the temple with that same thought, Rage. So everyone's allowed into the courtyard. Only Jews Jews or chosen ones are allowed into the actual temple area, and then only priests are allowed into the center of the temple. And then within there is the Holy of Holies. It's a room with a curtain in front of it, the curtain that tore in two when Jesus died. And behind that curtain is God. That's what they say. And only one priest is allowed in there once a year. And if he's not a holy man, he'll drop dead. Well, again, I mean, let's put it this way: if God was in there, well, why did he leave? Well, why is he? Isn't he omniscient and omnipresent? So yeah, all these ideas of putting God in a certain place, like the Holy of Holies in the temple or in the ark, that just seems to me, I think we can agree that just is childish interpretation.
Yeah, I think that most Christians, because I ask Christians this question a lot, and most of them tend to say like the stone tablets that had the 10 Commandments were in there, sacred things like that. That it was things that the Jews held sacred. But that I think that's what most Christians tell me was in there.
Yeah, just relics, really. Things that were important to them spiritually, but which had no power in the corporeal world. That is also a theory. But then you have to wonder, well, why are they hauling this around the city of Jericho? And I think they only do that on the last day, if I recall. So
yeah, I think it was the last day. Before Jesus brought down the walls.
Yeah, are they just trying to scare the Canaanites? I think the Canaanites would look out and they wouldn't know. They're just carrying a box around.
So I wanted you to get there because I knew that's where you were going to go, and I knew that this whole light scenario was important because that would imply saltpeter instead of regular salt.
Yeah.
The problem though, and here's the problem with it, is it's a completely separate metaphor. He's still talking to the same people, but just using a different metaphor. It has nothing to do with the salt at all. I'll read it to you again. Matthew 5:13 says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." That was 13. It then moves on to 14, and it is now a separate metaphor. It says, "You are the light of the world. The city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in this house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." Nothing in that metaphor has salt in it at all. It's not speaking of salt.
Right.
It's speaking of the same people that the salt was speaking of. But these are separate metaphors. Salt's a metaphor, light's a metaphor. They have nothing to do with each other.
Want to quick jump in, just let everybody know that we will go to Q&A soon. So just giving you guys a quick short warning.
All right, so I'll skip about 150 points, James, to get to my end points.
Okay, well, let me answer to that one. I think they are connected. And again, I have to admit, Luke, who I rest my theory really upon, because he's the one who mentions the land and the dunghill, and there's really no use for salt on land unless you want to cause disaster. But I think back in Matthew, I think they are connected, because 13, I'll just read the first lines of each chapter. 13 says, "You are the salt of the earth." 14 says, "You are the light of the world." So yes, there's more in 13. If the salt, that's where we get if the salt has lost its flavor. But 13, 14 are two verses. Now remember, there were no chapters and verses when this was first written. So this is one continuous thought. You are the salt of the earth, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 lines later.
It clearly has a period at the end of that sentence there, so they're not
two
one
sentences.
long thought.
2 sentences.
There's and then it would be indented. These were definitely separate. They're talking about the same thing. They're talking about the followers of Jesus. Now, I would maintain that the man Yeshua was talking to his followers, and that's who he was talking to. But Christians would maintain that Yeshua, Jesus, was talking to everybody for the next 2,000 years that believe in him. And that's what the whole teaching is about. His believers. That is literally what the teaching is about. So you have to prove that it's saltpeter, or saltpeter is somehow relevant when the metaphor, when it's not. What's relevant is faith and belief in Christ, that's what makes you a Christian. That's ultimately what it's saying. Salt is just salt. And salt is actually a better analogy. Actually, I heard you in your first debate with Dr. It wasn't really a debate with Dr. Josh. It was more you being on non sequitur, and Dr. Josh was there to kind of give some biblical history. You kept saying, well, why would salt make any sense in this metaphor? And I'll tell you why. It's because salt is an ionic compound made of sodium and chloride ions. All life has evolved to depend on its chemical properties to survive. All life. Salt has been used by humans for thousands of years for food preservation and seasoning. Salt's ability to preserve food was essential for development of human civilization. Throughout history, salt was considered very valuable. That's another thing that I hear you say a lot. Like salt is this really bad thing in the Old Testament, but even in ancient Israel, salt was very valuable because it was difficult to obtain. It was a highly valued trade item and even a form of currency to certain peoples. So
Yeah,
salt is
that's
a very relevant
that's
metaphor if he's talking about his believers being sprinkled throughout the entire world, bringing light to the world. Salt would be a very relevant word to use for Jesus to use in this metaphor.
I think we have to
How-
go to Q&A pretty quick
Oh,
here.
sure.
All right, so I do need to say, like, the whole point of the debate is, all right, so I granted it's not does salt prove God, it would be does saltpeter prove God. We haven't even been able to prove that Jesus meant saltpeter, let alone how saltpeter would prove the existence of God.
Well, yeah, because you're sticking with Matthew. And by the way, I think if verse 13 says you're the salt of the earth, and then 14 says you're the light of the world, I think those are connected, but you disagree. But let's leave Matthew. You go to Luke, and he says quite clearly, when salt loses its flavor, which salt can't do, it is no longer good for the land or the dunghill. Now, what Jesus is, even if I think you agree, saltpeter was known back then, what he's doing is revealing to the peasants who just all they knew was you put manure on the land and the crops grow better. He's telling them the manure you're putting on the land is the same manure or feces that the high priests and the Levites have been getting saltpeter out of that provides light or explosive. So, but again, just when in Luke, when Jesus says flavor, it's no longer good for the land or the dunghill, then we're no longer talking about common salt. There's no way around that. We are
what
talking
he's
about
literally
salt.
doing is telling people.
We're gonna give Rage a quick last reply since we let Misha start, and then we'll go to Q&A.
All he's doing is telling his people that if you lose your faith, then you are nothing. This is actually, these passages right here are some of the passages that NIB members used to say that I am hated by God, that I am no longer loved by God, that I'm a reprobate, that because if you lose faith, then you're not even worth the dunghill. You're not even worth shit, basically. So I mean,
I've heard that explanation. It doesn't hold water. I agree.
We're gonna let Rage have a.
I agree with Rage.
That is literally the teaching here.
4 seconds, and then we'll go.
You know, you're maintaining that he means something. We didn't really have enough time to even get into whether saltpeter would prove the existence of God, let alone if this was what Jesus meant. But I really enjoyed having the conversation about whether or not this is what Jesus meant, because that was the fun part of the conversation anyway. But yeah, I'm done, James.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it, gentlemen.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to agree when someone is criticizing Rage and saying, like, sorry, I couldn't help it. Rage said Christians are calling him manure. I think it's Chan, that guy out of California, big fancy evangelical
I think I know
guy.
What you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, that's his interpretation of this, that you're manure. You're shit, basically, if you don't follow along. And if anyone's called you that, Rage, they're full of shit. You hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, you don't have to agree with all this stuff.
You hear it, Matt Powell. Misha's call it saying you're full of shit.
Yeah. So I just wanted to get that in there.
What on earth is going on tonight? So we are going to go to Q&A, folks. It's been an interesting discussion, that's for sure. First time I've heard that argument. And we will jump right into it, starting with Super Chats.
I want to ask you a bunch of questions, and I want to have them answered immediately.
First up, Brian Stevens, thanks for your Super Chat. He said, or a Patreon question. We appreciate that. He said, "Could people have figured all of these things about salt out without God?"
You're asking me?
Yes.
I don't think any thinking is possible. So we debate, how did the universe begin? I like to say this. I like to say, even before there was anything, 2 + 2 was still 4. And so you in other words, you can have a thought without any material in the universe. And so for me, the only way you can have a thought with or without a material universe is with God. So no, I would say you couldn't have figured out how to tie your shoes without God. That would be my answer.
Gotcha.
Which God though? Because the Mongols figured it out, and they definitely didn't believe in the Christian God.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But they believed in God. They were.
I think the
deists.
Mongols believed in the blue sky. I'm not sure what their deities were.
Yeah.
Kind of half Buddhist, half something else, I think.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll go to the next question.
Thank you.
Next up, thanks so much for your super chat from Spikes. If I mispronounce this, I'm so sorry. Is it Spike Smith or Spike Smith? Okay. Well, thanks for your question. They said, suppose every biblical salt reference actually meant saltpeter. Is that what makes the book true, or God or Jesus being real?
Yeah. No. The point I make is until Jesus, salt always means salt, unless they say niter, in which case it's a cleansing agent. But all throughout the Old Testament, like when a Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt, or when King Abimelech salts the fields of his enemies so they can't grow crops anymore, these are all disasters in the Old Testament. And it's not until Jesus that we have this new version of salt being even discussed. So no, none of the other versions, none of the other mentions of salt are in reference to saltpeter, except until we get to Jesus.
Gotcha.
Are we sure that Jesus meant saltpeter and not soft Peter?
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Next up, Mothra J Disco. Thanks for your super chat. They said, I really want to see Erica debate Misha now because W.
So do I. That would be good.
I don't know. What do they mean by W?
When
I don't know. I saw Erica debate Kent Hovind, and I thought it was such a shame that lovely young lady like that has all those degrees and she's not married yet and has no kids.
I don't
Maybe
know what
that's.
I don't know what that
stepped
means.
into it there, Misha.
We're going to move on. I'm not sure what that means, but anyway, she does well. Anyway, Hannibal of Carthage, thanks for your super chat. Cirrus versus Misha would be awesome. Maybe someday, who knows? Cirrus the Skeptic.
Cirrus the Skeptic.
Oh.
Gotcha. Let's see. Let's see. Next out, Mothra J Disco. The only real salt is Kent Hovind's. Oh no! Come on, I can't say that. I'm sorry. You know it wasn't in the live chat. We're trying to become more. Uh, They just said Kent Hovind was angry after that debate. Let's say we'll put it in that word. So, Kent Hovind's cellmate. Thanks for your super chat. I don't know if that's really Kent Hovind's cellmate, just to give a quick little disclaimer about that. But we do appreciate your super chat. They said for Popoff's ointment because he's reaching so hard. Okay, that's. I hadn't realized what that meant when I first read it. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, try to become more family friendly. I'm serious. Okay, Buck Melanoma, thanks for your super chat. They said, do cats and dogs go to heaven when they die? Misha?
Oh yeah, my kids ask me that all the time. And whatever we need to be happy will be in heaven. And God created all living things. So I guess, by the way, heaven isn't some other place. It's right here on earth. It'll be a whole new earth. So yeah, there'll be rocks and trees and fish and everything. Everything will be here. Everything you need to be happy will be here. And it'll be a perfect earth.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Let's see. Appreciate that. Let's see. Just because I always get a kick out of these, I'm pulling. There's one that just popped up in the chat that said Misha versus Richard Madsen. For some reason, I have a feeling you've crossed swords with Richard Madsen before. Am I wrong?
That name rings a bell. I don't mean to insult him, but I can't remember him right now.
massive luxurious beard.
Yeah, you guys get along. You guys are you're cut from the same cloth. So
Oh, good.
yeah, so that's pretty interesting. And what would that just mean? Oh, I hadn't known. I had been using this phrase the whole time. Apparently, if you say that two people they're like, I had heard this in the debate context, like, oh, they've crossed swords before, means they've debated before. But apparently there's an alternative there's an
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
alternative meaning, such that I hope you haven't crossed swords with Richard Madsen before. But next up,
No.
thanks for your. It's not what I meant. All right, thanks for your question. Next up, we've got another one. Uh, forgive me. I'm so sorry. I missed your name. But the person asked that for some reason I didn't get it down when I copy and pasted it. It said, "Does Misha know that baking soda is an acid?"
Actually, I don't know. Isn't it a base because you mix it with vinegar? Yeah, baking soda is one of the substances they thought was a version of saltpeter or salt. But yeah, I don't think it's an acid per se.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see. Next up, I'm going to try to get through as many of these questions as possible. Forgive me if I miss any, but I think I've got them. Here we go. Next up, Rachel Raphael Block, sorry about that, said, does Misha have the original Greek word and a citation for a translation to back up his claim?
Yeah, I go into that. I'm actually working on a book on this. It'll be titled Gunpowder and God. And yeah, I'll be going into quite a bit of that, but and not only the original Greek for the New Testament and the Hebrew for the Old, but then what the early church fathers thought. And so yeah, and then the first English translations of the Bible. And just so you know, for me, we skip about 15 or 1600 years, because it's not until the British Empire is involved that there's really that the search for aerial saltpeter really begins. So all before that, we're just dealing with earthly saltpeter obtained from feces. So yeah, it's when you get into the 17th century, that's when things really get interesting. So I look at biblical translations like early Wycliffe and stuff from the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Next up, thanks for your question, Fourth Dimensional Jake. They asked, you say you trust the Bible that they didn't have war machines at Jericho, but don't trust the Bible, or you say you trust the Bible that there were no war machines at Jericho, and yet you don't trust the Bible when they don't tell you about the gunpowder they quote unquote definitely had.
I think they do tell us. There's an old rule in like in alchemy and the Kabbalah, and some people use this rule. By the way, Christopher John Birkness for uncovering 9/11. The rule is the devil has to tell you the truth. So I don't think it was an act of God when the Israelites brought down the walls of Jericho, and I think they did. I think they put the seeds of the truth within the story. And why else do they need Rahab's help? Why do they need her help? Well, she happens to have an apartment in the wall. So it's like they're letting you know, like they didn't have to tell us that, right? It's kind of embarrassing that these Israelites hung out with a prostitute, you know.
There's your way how the Israelites got in there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they're revealing the truth. The devil always has to tell the truth.
Gotcha.
So in some way or form.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thanks for your question, Germania. Let me know if I mispronounced that. If I did, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
They asked, off topic, but my question is there sin in heaven? And they said, if not, how did Lucifer sin? And if there is sin in heaven, then does heaven suffer the same consequences as earth?
Yeah. I think that's a confusion over sin. So once we're saved, to sin anymore, and yet we're all sinners. And here's the distinction is between a sin of thought. So I'm saved, but I admit, I tell my wife this all the time. If I see a woman with a low cut blouse, whoa, I looked, but I haven't acted. And so Lucifer was thrown out of heaven, not because he acted out his sin. He thought it. He dared think And he thought, hey, God, I'm as good as you. I'm better. And that's it. That's all God needed. He said, okay, you're out of here. God didn't have to wait for him to act on his sin. So there's a distinction there that a lot of Christians miss. And again, they say, oh, we're all sinners, and we're not. If you think a sin, as I just admitted I do, it's when you cross the line and act upon it. So in short, the devil never got a chance to act upon his sin, and he was thrown out of heaven with 1/3 of the angels.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And next up, I think this is the last one we have. Killadoggy1, thanks for your question. They asked, question for Misha, when does Jesus come back, or when Jesus does come back, how much ammunition will he be carrying with him?
Yeah, Jesus has power beyond all recognition, and you can just see that in the night sky when there's lightning like there is tonight. And by the way, lightning, it's igniting the nitrogen in the Earth's atmosphere, and that's why you go outside in a lightning storm and you can smells. They call that ozone. That's when the oxygen molecules unite into a two instead of single. They're two-part, and I guess they smell different. But that's from the electrical ignition of the nitrogen in the Earth's atmosphere. And so maybe he'll make use of nitrogen, but he has power beyond anything that we've ever come up with.
You got it. Next, we appreciate everybody being here tonight. It's always a pleasure. And so, our dear friends, Misha and Rage, thank you guys for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, and thanks, Rage. I think we had a good, healthy debate, and
it was fun.
There's no scars at the end. I'd love to debate you again in this manner.
Oh yeah, and you're come on my show anytime. We're always looking to have good conversation. Good conversation. I'd love to continue it. I have about 250 more things I want to talk about in regards to this. So we could have went on for about 4 more hours probably.
Sure. Yeah, I'll send you an email through James. I'd be happy to do that. And thanks, James. Thanks again for having us.
You bet. Thank you, guys. And their links, folks, are down in the description. So that way you can hear more if you were like, I want more. And also, very excited. We are going on tour in less than a week. So in less than a week, I will be in Texas. Right now I'm in Colorado. This is where I live. I like it. Mountains, all that. But to get to go to Texas where it's nice and warm, not bad. That's where Misha is right now.
Yeah.
That's right. That's how you know it's good. I'm going to be in Texas. It's going to be warm, and more importantly, it's going to be a lot of fun. Some epic debates, folks. So I had already showed you the one with Mike Jones and Matt Dillahunty. Just have to mention a couple more, guys. It's going to be epic, to say the least. We are pumped that Aaron Ra, who is, a lot of people don't know this, but Aaron Ra, I mean, we love him, terrific guy, very friendly. He is actually Raging Atheist's dad. It's quite crazy. A lot of people didn't know. Not really. I made that up.
I call him OG Raging Atheist. So
yes. No, he's a really personable guy. We like him a lot. And yes, both Rage and Aaron Ra are. And so but yeah, we're excited. And then also, even bigger surprise, you guys probably didn't know this, but next week we're also pumped that during that debate tour, Flat Earth debate between Nathan Thompson and Team Skeptic. This is one we're just like, dear gosh, like I hope that people are like, we hope they survive this one. They've got a bad history. We're a little bit afraid that this one might go a little bit overboard, but I think it's going to be safe. But it's going to be wild. Hopefully everybody gets along. And so we are excited. And by the way, even more crazy, you're not going to believe this. Nathan Thompson, the Flat Earther, Raging Atheist brother. Crazy. Unbelievable.
So, don't do that to me, James. Oh.
It's wild stuff. Everybody's related around here. So anyway, folks, thanks for being here. It's always a fun time. So thanks for coming by, everybody. Hope you keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care, and thanks again to our debater guests for coming on tonight.
God bless you guys, both of you.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.